4 veterans came home from war and vanished without a trace, branded deserters by their own town. Behind closed doors, powerful men buried the truth beneath church floors and false gravestones. But one old soldier and his dog uncovered the map they never meant to be found. And just wait until you see how this forgotten injustice was finally brought into the light. Morgan's Hollow wasn't the kind of place you found on most maps. Tucked between 2 faded highways and a ridge of weather-beaten hills, it had 1 gas station, 1 diner, and a church that hadn't rung its bell since 1973. It was the kind of town where habits didn't just form, they calcified. People knew when you changed your brand of coffee. They remembered the exact day your porch light stopped working. And they definitely noticed when someone new, or worse, someone long forgotten, came back. Hank Willis didn't expect a welcome when he returned. He certainly didn't get one. The most he got were a few glances through parted curtains and the occasional nod at the grocery store, the kind where the chin barely lifts and the eyes don't quite meet yours. He was older now, grayer, quieter. He walked with a stiffness in his spine that hadn't been there before the war, and he carried that same battered duffel he'd left with 20 years ago. People remembered Hank, the way he used to play football in the lot behind the general store, the girl he was supposed to marry, the mother who moved away without leaving a forwarding address. They remembered, sure, but they didn't ask. Hank didn't mind. All he wanted was quiet. That's why he moved into the old caretaker's cottage behind the church, a squat little place with sagging eaves and windows that groaned in the wind. The churchyard itself had long since stopped hosting Sunday sermons. Its roof was caved in on one side, the stained glass windows dulled by dust and ivy. But the graveyard, that was still there, silent, moss-covered, half forgotten, just like Hank. He wasn't alone, though. His only company was Roscoe, a big, rangy mutt with too much German shepherd and too much personality. The kind of dog who didn't bark without reason, didn't beg for attention, and didn't trust anyone except Hank. They'd been through things together, places most people in Morgan's Hollow had only heard about on the news and quickly turned off. At first, it seemed like Roscoe was adjusting well. He explored the overgrown yard, sniffed the corners of the church, kept watch from the porch. But then he started doing something strange. Every morning, right before sunrise, Roscoe would slip through the broken picket fence and trot down the hill to the graveyard. And every time, he went straight to the same spot, a patch of sunken ground nestled between 2 old gravestones. Neither marker had a name you could read anymore. Just weather-worn stone and flaking lichen. One leaned so far to the side it looked ready to fall. And that's where Roscoe would dig. Not frantically, not like he was chasing a scent or looking for a rabbit. Slowly, methodically, like he knew where to dig. Like he was trying to unearth something with care. Hank watched it the first time and didn't think much of it. But when Roscoe returned the next morning, and the next after that, always at dawn, always to that same forgotten strip of earth, it started to bother him. The town noticed too. Tom Dillard, who ran the auto shop and fancied himself a comedian, cracked jokes of it over coffee. "Maybe your mutt found himself a chew-tar 6 feet under," he snorted, tapping ash off his cigarette. "Or maybe he's looking for treasure. Ain't that right, Hank?" Others chuckled, not unkindly, but with that edge of small-town mockery, the kind that pretends to be friendly but always has a sting. Kids started daring each other to run up and touch the grave and sprint back before Roscoe could bark. Teenagers made up stories, that it was a witch's grave, or a soldier buried without a name, or a cursed spot that made dogs go crazy. The laughter never lasted long. Roscoe didn't bark, didn't chase. He just stared at them with steady, unblinking eyes until they left. And they always did. Hank never joined in the jokes. He'd seen what fear looked like. He'd seen what silence could hide. And something about the way Roscoe stood over that dirt, his body rigid, ears back, tail low, it made something twist deep in Hank's gut. The dog wasn't just digging. He was warning. Hank tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just instinct. Maybe an animal had been buried there, or some chemical in the soil was drawing Roscoe's attention. But he'd raised that dog since he was a pup. They'd crossed minefields together, slept and bombed out villages. Roscoe had once sniffed out a trap in a dark alley seconds before it would have blown them both sky high. And now, here in sleepy Morgan's Hollow, he was trying to tell him something. But what? And why here? The sun kept rising, and Roscoe kept digging. And Hank, for the first time in years, started to feel that old itch between his shoulder blades. The one he only ever felt when danger was close and no one else could see it. Something was buried in that graveyard, and it wasn't just bones. The storm rolled in with the kind of wind that rattled window panes and made trees groan in the dark. By late afternoon, Morgan's Hollow was wrapped in a heavy gray downpour. The gutters overflowed, the power flickered, and the streets ran with muddy water. Most folks stayed inside, curtains drawn, waiting for it to pass. But not Roscoe. Despite the thunder, despite the pounding rain, the dog was agitated, pacing the floor of the cottage, whining low in his throat, tail twitching. Hank had never seen him like this, not even doing fireworks or storms overseas. This wasn't fear, it was something else, something urgent. When Roscoe finally scratched at the door, Hank didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, pulled on his boots, and followed the dog out into the storm. The rain soaked through Hank's clothes in seconds, but Roscoe didn't slow down. He bounded through the tall grass, past the church, and into the heart of the old graveyard, stopping at that same sunken patch of ground between the crumbling stones. His paws went to work again, clawing faster, deeper, mud flying in every direction. Hank stepped closer, boots sinking into the flooded earth, and then he saw it. Something was sticking out of the ground, just barely. A corner of wood, soft and blackened by years underground, warped and splintered at the edge. Hank dropped to one knee, not even feeling the cold mud soaking into his jeans, and began digging with his bare hands. He worked beside Roscoe in silence, the rain washing dirt from his fingers as he pulled away handfuls of wet soil. After a few minutes, they uncovered it. It was a box, metal, dented and covered in rust, about the size of a toolbox. The wood Hank had seen was the remains of what used to be a crate or cover. The box itself had no labels, no markings, just a thick padlock, almost fused shut from corrosion. Hank lifted it with effort. It was heavier than he expected. Roscoe didn't follow him back. The dog stayed beside the disturbed earth, standing perfectly still as the wind pushed against his coat. Back at the cottage, Hank set the box on the old kitchen table and grabbed his crowbar. It took effort. The lock gave a stubborn fight, but eventually, with a groan of metal, it snapped open. The lid creaked. Inside, time had stopped. There were papers, dozens of them, folded and yellowed, their edges brittle, some stuck together with moisture. On top was a military envelope, its seal broken long ago. Beneath that, a cloth bundle wrapped tightly in what looked like old oilskin. Hank reached for it with care, his fingertips trembling slightly. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a map. Not just any map. It was hand-drawn, thick parchment worn at the folds, marked in faded ink with street names, property lines, and notes scribbled in the margins. At the center was the church, clearly outlined, and just behind it, near the corner of the graveyard, a red X. The exact spot where Roscoe had been digging. For a long moment, Hank just stared at it. Then he noticed the handwriting. In one corner of the map, beside the X, someone had scrawled two words in thick, uneven strokes, almost like a warning. Do not disturb. The words chilled him more than the rain had. Because whoever wrote that hadn't meant it for just anyone. They had meant it for someone like him. Someone who might actually go looking. He turned back to the pile of documents. One by one, he began unfolding them, laying them out across the table. Most were military. Typed forms, service records, discharge certificates, all of them aged but legible. One name appeared more than once, stamped in bold across the top of several documents. Elias Hargrove. Hank's breath caught in his chest. He knew that name. There was a plaque just outside the town hall, polished every Memorial Day by local scouts. Elias Hargrove's name was carved in bronze on that plaque, listed among the men from Morgan's Hollow who had given their lives in honorable service. Killed in action, buried overseas. Or so they said. But now, here was his file, folded and forgotten in a rusted box under a nameless grave. And that wasn't all. Some of the documents didn't line up, dates were wrong, pages missing, and at least one letter, written in scrawled cursive and never mailed, hinted at things Hank didn't yet understand. It was addressed to someone named Ruth, dated late 1946. They said we're being watched, can't talk over the phone anymore, it's not safe. I'll leave this with the old caretaker if something happens. If you're reading this, it means I never got out. Hank felt a chill move down his spine. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cottage, everything was still. He looked down at the red X on the map again. Whatever had happened back then, someone wanted it buried. And his dog, the one who never barked at shadows, had found the one place no one wanted disturbed. That night, long after Roscoe had finally curled up by the door and the wind had faded into silence, Hank lay awake staring at the ceiling. The documents were spread across the table like puzzle pieces, and that map, with its faded ink and two ominous words, sat unfolded beneath a flickering lamp. Do not disturb. But something was already disturbed, and there was no going back now.
The storm passed, but something in Hank didn't settle. The box, the map, the documents, they weren't just relics from another time. They were pieces of a story no one in town had ever told. And something deep in Hank's gut told him this wasn't over, it was just beginning. He started digging, not with shovels this time, but with questions. Every morning he drove into town and sat in the back corner of the small library, sifting through old microfilm, faded town ledgers, and yellowed newspaper clippings. He flipped through church bulletins stacked in dusty cardboard boxes, asked quiet questions to people who didn't want to remember. Most gave polite shrugs. Some changed the subject. But Hank kept digging. He started with Elias Hargrove, the man whose name appeared again and again in the papers he'd found. According to the town's official records, Elias had returned home from the Pacific Theater in the spring of 1946. He'd been honorably discharged, sent home with a small pension, and listed as resettled in Morgan's Hollow. And then, nothing. No job records, no marriage, no medical visits, no mention in the church logs after that date. It was as if he'd vanished, erased without explanation. But Elias wasn't the only one. 3 more names came up, all veterans, all from Morgan's Hollow, all listed as returned in the spring or summer of '46. And all of them, just like Elias, disappeared within months of coming home. Daniel Riggs, Thomas Brower, Harold Boone. The town had explanations, of course. It always did. Quiet ones muttered behind closed doors. Oh, Danny just couldn't handle being back. Walked off one night, never came back. Boone, poor soul. He was never right after the war, probably living off the grid somewhere. Some of them just didn't want to be found. But Hank had seen what real desertion looked like, both in the field and back home. He'd served alongside men who ran and men who cracked. It didn't look like this. This was too neat, too quiet, too covered. And then came the break. In a crumbling manila folder at the back of the library's archive room, sandwiched between property tax records and old sermons, Hank found a brittle copy of the Morgan County Register, dated October 3, 1949. The headline was small, tucked near the bottom of the page. Caretaker found dead in church basement. Police rule it suicide. The article was brief, barely a paragraph. It stated that Emery Bell, longtime groundskeeper of St. Luke's Church, had been discovered in the basement of the church late one evening by a member of the parish council. The cause of death was listed as self-inflicted. The police found no signs of foul play. There had been, the article noted, brief mention of bizarre claims, including rumors that the caretaker had been housing former soldiers in the church basement. But the police had dismissed these as the confused ramblings of an old man in declining health. No investigation followed. No names were listed. No further articles ever mentioned it again. Hank stared at the clipping for a long time. There was no photo, no follow-up, just a small, quiet ending to a man's life, and the faintest trace of something no one wanted to acknowledge. He looked up from the paper, his jaw tight. All at once, the pieces started clicking into place, not perfectly, but with just enough sharp edges to cut through the silence. Elias Hargroves hadn't died overseas. He'd made it back home. And then he'd been hidden, or worse, silenced, by someone who wanted to make sure he never spoke again. Why? That part still didn't make sense. But Hank knew the look of something being buried, and not just under soil. Buried with intent. Buried to protect a truth too uncomfortable to speak aloud. He walked out of the library without saying a word. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town square. Kids were riding their bikes past the diner, where old men drank coffee and pretended nothing ever changed. The flag outside the town hall flapped gently in the breeze, casting its shadow on the polished war memorial. Hank stood there a while, hands in his pockets, boots planted in the dirt, staring at the plaque. The names etched in bronze gleamed in the fading light. Elias Hargrove, Daniel Riggs, Thomas Brower, Harold Boone. All listed, all honored, all supposedly buried with dignity. But Hank had seen what dignity looked like. It didn't come wrapped in silence. And it didn't come with warnings scribbled in ink across old maps. That night, back at the cottage, Hank didn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the wind move through the tall grass, his eyes fixed on the churchyard. There were too many missing pieces, and too many lies buried just beneath the surface. Someone had hidden the truth for nearly 80 years, and somehow his dog had started to uncover it. The rain came again that night, soft at first, a whisper against the windows, then heavier, steady. The kind that soaked the earth but didn't stir the wind, the kind that made the whole world feel hushed. Hank sat in the dim glow of the oil lamp, the old map spread out in front of him. The red X circled again and again in his mind. The documents were sorted now, labeled, cross-referenced, their patterns stitched together like a quilt of half-remembered names and silenced timelines. He wasn't a detective, but he'd been trained to read terrain, to find signals others missed. And everything pointed to one place, beneath the church. That's when Roscoe started growling. It wasn't loud, just a low, rolling growl deep in his chest, the kind that didn't stop. He was sitting by the door, ears forward, eyes locked on the dark silhouette of the church just beyond the window. Every muscle in his body was alert, focused. Hank didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight, shrugged into his jacket, and followed the dog out into the wet night. The rain soaked through his collar as they crossed the field. The church loomed ahead, tall, rotting, hollowed out by time. Roscoe didn't slow down. He reached the door and scratched once before pushing it open with his nose. The hinges barely made a sound. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and old wood. Rain tapped through holes in the roof. The pews were warped, some tipped over. Stained glass windows sagged in their frames, long since dulled by dust and years of neglect. And yet, something hung in the air. Not just silence, something watchful. Roscoe padded forward, his nails tapping softly on the warped floorboards, and stopped at the far end of the sanctuary, near what used to be the altar. There, in the corner, part of the floor looked different. Less dust, a newer board. He began to paw at it. Hank knelt beside him, running his hand along the edge of the plank. His fingers found a small notch, worn but intentional. He wedged the crowbar in, pressed down, and the board popped loose with a reluctant groan. Beneath it, more wood. Then metal hinges. A trapdoor. Hank pried it open. The scent that rose up was old earth and iron. He shone the flashlight into the black below. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, carved from stone and sagging timber. He looked at Roscoe. The dog looked back, tail still, eye steady, and together they went down. The air grew colder as they descended. The light from above disappeared, replaced only by the flickering beam of Hank's flashlight, cutting through the dark like a blade. The stairs creaked under his boots, each step echoing. At the bottom, the beam of light swept across the space, and Hank froze. It was a room, crude, hand-built, not just a cellar, a bunker. The stone walls were lined with shelves, stacked with empty cans and tools long rusted through. Against one wall stood 4 iron-framed beds, their thin mattresses eaten by rot. Blankets lay crumpled at the edges. Nearby sat 4 folding chairs, arranged in a tight circle. And hanging on the wall, just above them, 4 worn military ID tags. Each one belonged to a man Hank had read about. Elias Hargrove, Daniel Riggs, Thomas Brower, Harold Boone. All of them had returned from war. All of them had ended up here. Their presence was everywhere, in the coats hanging limp from rusted hooks, in the boots lined by the wall, in the water-stained photographs tucked under a bed frame. This had been a hiding place, a sanctuary, or perhaps a prison. Roscoe stood in the center of the room now, his gaze fixed on something in the middle of the floor. Hank followed his eyes. A rusted oil drum, sealed shut. Caked in layers of dust and old concrete, the drum looked like it had been dragged, half buried, then left to disappear beneath time. But the surface was cracked in one place. Hank stepped closer, slowly, the beam of his flashlight revealing the faintest signs of damage to the top, as if someone had tried to break in or seal it even tighter. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what was inside. His breath came shallow now. The weight of it all, the silence, the truth, the deliberate nature of it, pressed against him like the walls were closing in. Roscoe sat beside the barrel and didn't move. He didn't growl. He didn't whine. He just watched. The rain continued above, now nothing more than a distant murmur. The church creaked. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the concrete lid with a hollow tick. It was the sound of something ending. At sunrise, Hank walked into the sheriff's office carrying a folder thick with documents, photographs, and the map sealed inside a plastic sleeve. Mud still clung to his boots. Roscoe padded in beside him, quiet as ever. Deputy Corbin looked up from his desk and blinked. "Can I help you?" Hank said nothing, just laid the folder on the desk, opened it, and began to speak. He told them about the bunker, the beds, the dog tags, the barrel, everything. The sheriff, a man who'd grown up in Morgan's Hollow, and whose father had served on the town council in the 1950s, said very little. He took the papers, read in silence, then picked up the phone. Roscoe didn't bark, but as the sheriff turned toward the wall behind him, the one lined with framed photos of town officials from generations past, the dog growled, low, steady. His eyes locked on one portrait in particular, a smiling man in a suit, dated 1948, Mayor William Halbrook. Hank followed Roscoe's gaze. He stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because now the silence was cracking, and buried truths were clawing their way to the surface.
Word of the seller traveled faster than any rumor Morgan's Hollow had ever traded. By mid-morning, the churchyard was cordoned off with yellow tape, the ground a careful grid under portable lights. State investigators came in unmarked sedans, speaking in low voices, stepping softly around the places Roscoe had chosen. Photographers moved methodically, documenting every coat, every bunk, every cracked cup that time had left behind. Hank stood back with Roscoe under the drooping branches of an elm. He said little. He didn't need to. The map, the documents, the dog tags, they spoke for him. The lab results were handled with unusual speed. Officials didn't release the full reports to the public, but enough filtered out to redraw the town's memory. The remains in the sealed drum matched the 4 names etched in bronze outside the town hall. The injuries were clear enough for the medical examiner to rule that their deaths were not accidents. No more talk of men who wandered off, no more muttered tales about soft minds and restless feet. The story the town had told itself for decades folded in on itself, and when it did, a different story unfurled, one with deliberate actions and deliberate silence. The sheriff turned the files over to the state attorney. Subpoenas followed. A thin seam of history split open, and people who had long preferred to be remembered only for their charity drives and ribbon cuttings found themselves answering questions under oath. A faded photograph on the sheriff's wall, the smiling face Hank and Roscoe had stared at, returned in news clippings and old minutes from council meetings. There, tucked between resolutions about sidewalks and street repairs, were signatures that placed certain men in certain rooms at certain times. The pattern was impossible to ignore. It didn't have a grand name, not then, just a phrase people said with a certain flatness, a group of concerned citizens. They met after the war, quietly at first, convinced they were defending the town's good name from the turmoil of returning soldiers. A handful of them held positions of influence, a deacon who chaired the parish committee, 2 councilmen who controlled budgets, a police lieutenant who has since passed, and they used that influence to steer attention away when attention would have saved lives. The words in their own minutes said as much, without ever saying too much. The deacon had died years earlier, his obituary full of hymns and harvest suppers. Others had moved away or followed him into the ground. But 2 of the old names were still alive, still in town, still offering handshakes on Main Street. A retired councilman whose portrait hung in the hallway of the municipal building, and a former store owner known for sponsoring Little League uniforms. They had grandchildren at the county school, and plaques on the donation wall of the library. When the warrants came, they did not come with spectacle. No sirens, no raised voices, just paper, signatures, and the quiet push of a door. The charges were careful and exact, not a verdict, but the formal recognition that there was a case to answer. Their families closed blinds, their friends stopped waving, the portraits came down. In a place that had always prided itself on knowing everyone's business, people suddenly learned the difference between gossip and history. The town did not tear itself apart. It didn't need to. It simply had to listen, to records, to dates, to a map that warned against digging, and to a dog that insisted on it anyway. A week later, the council chamber filled beyond standing room. The air was warm and close. People who had not set foot in the building for years stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in their hands, waiting for the meeting to begin. The agenda was simple.
Update from the sheriff, motion to authorize replacement markers at the churchyard, and the public's right to speak. Hank arrived late and stayed in the back, Roscoe at his heel. He wore the same jacket he always did, the one that smelled faintly of rain and old caper. The sheriff spoke first, reading from prepared remarks. He didn't use adjectives. He didn't need them. He laid out the sequence as plainly as fence posts: discovery, verification, next steps. Then the mayor looked to the back of the room. "Mr. Willis," he said, careful, almost formal, "if you'd like to add anything." The room turned. 100 eyes landed on one man and one dog. Hank didn't step forward. He just lifted his chin, his voice steady enough to carry. "They were heroes," he said, "and this town buried them twice." Nothing more. No arguments, no accusations, just the truth, stated without embroidery, laid across the room like a flag. Something changed then. Not loudly, not all at once, but it changed. The vote to authorize new headstones was unanimous and immediate. The motion to create a permanent record in the county archive passed with it. A committee volunteered to reach out to the families, some local, some account over, some listed only in an old letter that had waited for decades in a rusted box. People who had once laughed at a dog's fixation now signed their names to a ledger promising care. By the end of the month, work crews had cleaned the churchyard and leveled the sunken earth with quiet precision. A stonemason from the next town over delivered 4 slabs of Vermont marble, simple, pale, and dignified. The inscriptions were brief and exact. Elias Hargrove, Daniel Riggs, Thomas Brower, Harold Bone. Honorably served, remembered at last. There was no parade, no speeches that tried to turn regret into performance. The dedication took place on a bright morning, with the wind moving gently through the elms and the bell of the disused church silent above them. A pastor read a short prayer. The sheriff bowed his head. A woman in her 70s, Ruth's niece, found through county records and a line in that unsent letter, placed 4 small flags in the grass and whispered a thank you that no one needed to hear to understand. Hank stood a few paces back, his hands in his pockets, the brim of his cap low against the sun. Roscoe sat beside him, ears relaxed, breathing slow. When the last stone was set and the last ribbon of rope pulled away, the dog rose, trotted forward, and sniffed the base of each marker as if taking inventory. Then he turned, looked at Hank, and lay down in the shade. He didn't dig. He never dug there again. In the weeks that followed, life in Morgan's Hollow returned to something like normal, though the shape of the town had altered in a way only those who lived there could feel. The council replaced 2 portraits with a framed copy of the new memorial resolution. The library added a binder, St. Luke's Records, 1946 to 1950, with tabs and scanned pages and a note at the front in Hank's careful script. For the record, for the families, for the truth. The war memorial downtown got more visitors than it had in years, and sometimes there were fresh flowers where no one knew who had left them. The legal process moved at its own measured pace, as it should. To the people who had waited decades without knowing they were waiting, months no longer felt like an eternity. The important part had already happened. The story had been put back in its proper order. Wrong names had been removed from whispered lists. Right names had been carved in stone. On a quiet evening, Hank and Roscoe walked the edge of the churchyard one last time. Fireflies had begun to flicker in the tall grass. The new stones caught the last light of the day and held it for a moment before surrendering it to dusk. Hank touched the nearest marker with 2 fingers and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the night the map came open on his table. "Rest easy," he said, barely more than a murmur. They took the long way home along the fence line. The town behind them was the same and not the same, still the kind of place where people knew your dog's name, but now also the kind of place that knew what it had tried to forget and chose to remember anyway.
Justice, in the end, hadn't arrived like a storm. It had come like daylight, inevitable, unhurried, leaving no corner untouched. And in the heart of Morgan's Hollow, 4 white stones stood under the morning sun, names clear, ground undisturbed, while a good dog finally lay down and closed his eyes.